Hello, my name is David Crump, and I'm a member of an organization called the Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I want to thank you for joining our visit here today with an important personage in this field. His name is Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a Dutch-Palestinian Middle East analyst and an expert in the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestinian affairs. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and a fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, as well as at Democracy for the Arab World Now. Mouin has served with the United Nations, the International Crisis Group, and Al-Haq. He is a co-editor of Jadaliyya, managing editor at the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development, and contributing editor of the Middle East Report. He is insightful, articulate, informed, and remarkably ironic in this field, which sometimes can become rather heated. As you can tell, he is also an incredibly busy man, and so we're very grateful that he can make time in his schedule to be with us here today. Welcome, Mouin.
Thank you, David, and thank you also to you and the Christian Forum for the invitation to speak with you today.
You bet. It's our pleasure. Maybe it'd be good if our audience could get to know a little bit about your personal backstory here as you introduce yourself. You're a Palestinian who grew up in the Netherlands.
Correct.
Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, my parents are from Haifa and were, like most other Palestinians, transformed into stateless refugees as a result of the establishment of Israel in 1948. My father came to the Netherlands as a student in the 1950s, and the nuclear family has been there ever since. And it's also where I picked up the accent in English, because when it came time for my parents to send their children to school, we already spoke Dutch just by virtue of living there. And the only other country that had a similar language was South Africa. And so my parents decided to educate us in English for historical reasons. A British school was absolutely out of the question. So they sent us to an American school, and I subsequently did my university studies in the United States, and then worked in Palestine in the human rights and development field for a number of years, and then lived in Jordan for about 15 years. So that briefly is my background.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to invite Gary Burge to join the conversation.
Mouin, so good to have you with us. We are just excited about learning things that we haven't heard before. Our group is a group of scholar teachers who have been pursuing understanding of this very painful subject for a very long time. Let me just begin by just asking you to summarize for our listeners, what is the humanitarian situation like on the ground right now in Gaza?
Well, currently it's absolutely catastrophic and getting worse by the day for a number of reasons. Israel has imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip since 2006, 2007. So it was already a restricted environment. It was a situation, in fact, in which a very large proportion of consumer goods could only enter the Gaza Strip through tunnels from Egypt. But these were largely closed down after General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi seized power in Cairo in 2013 and systematically closed them down. Then, beginning immediately after the attacks of the 7th of October 2023, Israel imposed a very tight siege on the Gaza Strip. And in response to international pressure, it allowed a very minimal amount of goods to enter the Gaza Strip periodically or on a daily basis, far below both what entered the territory before October 2023 and certainly very far below what is required. Then on the 2nd of March of this year, when Israel basically unilaterally abrogated the January ceasefire agreement that had been reached by the incoming Trump administration. Israel imposed a hermetic siege on the Gaza Strip. No food, no water, no fuel, no medicines, no electricity. And in addition to that, it has basically prohibited any of the international humanitarian organizations, such as the United Nations Agency, World Central Kitchen, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, and so on. It has effectively prohibited them from operating by preventing them from bringing a single loaf of bread, a drop of water, a drop of fuel, or a volt of electricity into the Gaza Strip. And what it has done instead is it has imposed a so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, one of the most Orwellian names out there, on the Gaza Strip. This is a project that was designed for the Israeli military by Boston Consulting Group and the Tony Blair Institute. And you ask any humanitarian professional, and they will say, when you're dealing with a crisis such as you have in the Gaza Strip, the most important remedy is to flood the territory with humanitarian supplies. What we've seen instead is that the GHF established 4 distribution points, meaning that Palestinians, whether they're able or old or sick or immobilized, often have to travel long distances on foot to these distribution sites to receive, for example, pasta, which they can't really eat because there's no clean water in which to boil it, and so on. And over 700 Palestinians have been massacred at these distribution sites, which are essentially kill zones masquerading as humanitarian distribution centers. Yes.
So, Mouin, before we get to the distribution centers, can I just go back, and I just don't want to miss something that you started out with. Here's what I just do not understand. All right, so that in March, the Israelis put this very strict quarantine on the Gaza Strip. We're familiar with that. We've got over 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. And why we keep talking about we are almost in catastrophic famine. Well, okay, why not in April and May didn't 100,000 Gazans starve to death? In other words, if you shut off all of the food to an area like that, it would seem to me that from very early on, there was like no food coming in here, and the capacity of Gaza to produce food was bombed. Agricultural areas are destroyed. So how are they eating anything after March and April, May, and June? I don't understand why we did not have a catastrophic number of starvations.
Well, there were limited reserves of food supplies that had come in between January and March. And so those helped sustain the population at a minimal level. What has happened since then is that the only new supplies available are these food packages being distributed by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and they're clearly insufficient. And although we haven't yet seen a full-blown famine in the Gaza Strip, we have seen cases of, for example, people with pre-existing conditions dying first. We have seen many cases of thoroughly emaciated children dying of malnutrition, of, for example, kidney patients dying because they no longer are able to undergo dialysis and so on. So you're right. We have not yet seen a full-blown famine, but at the same time, we are very rapidly getting there if no solution is found soon. So in answer to your question, I would say there were some reserves. available when the siege was
Right.
reimposed on the 2nd of March.
Okay.
But they've clearly been insufficient.
Okay, so now we have this humanitarian foundation, which, as you were, well, I interrupted you there just to go back and
That's
read
fine.
that. So we have this foundation. They have a limited number of feeding centers. They, all of the professionals say this is not the way you do it. But we are reading about people going to these centers, and when they go, they are killed.
Mhm.
So what in the world is happening there? Israeli soldiers are shooting them. The Israelis are saying, well, Hamas is shooting them. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I think to answer your question, we need to first understand the purpose of this project, and it was quite explicitly stated from the outset. What Israel is seeking to do is to relocate the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip to the southern part of that territory, basically to Rafah and the border area
Right.
with Egypt. And what it has done to promote that objective is essentially to weaponize food, to weaponize humanitarian aid by setting up these distribution zones in the central and southern portions of the Gaza Strip so that Palestinians are essentially drawn towards them like a magnet, if you will. You know, if you want to eat and live, you have to come to these areas, and if you don't, you get nothing. At the same time, regarding these distribution centers, they're very unclear rules. So, for example, first of all, they have much less capacity than the population they're intended to serve. So, tens of thousands of people will show up. They will be told they have to wait until 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. or whatever before they can enter. And the minute that's available, there's like a rush towards the distribution center, and then the Israelis have these kind of imaginary red lines where anyone who crosses them is considered a legitimate military threat and gets a bullet to the head. So it's primarily the Israelis who have been doing the killing with snipers and on occasion tank shells and so on. But we now also have evidence from the Associated Press that the staff of this foundation, who are primarily US mercenaries, are themselves engaging in these killings. And the Associated Press, for example, distributed a video in which you can hear one of the American mercenaries taking a shot at a Palestinian, and his colleagues celebrating that he scored a hit. And then, in addition to that, there are also Palestinian gangs who are armed and supported by the Israelis. I think also partially for purposes of perimeter defense of these facilities, and they have been engaged in these killings and massacres as well. I just want to make one more point that, you know, the objective of this project is quite clear: to weaponize aid in order to
Right.
relocate Palestinians from one area of the Gaza Strip to the other.
Yeah.
The pretext that's given for this is that it is to ensure that Hamas does not steal the aid and then use it to sell it, for example, at inflated prices on market in order to finance its operations. What every single aid agency that's working in the Gaza Strip has said is that not only is there no evidence of Hamas looting this aid, but they have never been given evidence of this by the Israelis, either publicly or privately, and that the looting that is taking place is being conducted either by these militias, Palestinian militias that Israel has set up and armed, and these are people who are basically storming trucks in areas under Israeli control, looting the aid and then selling it for exorbitant prices on market, or in other cases where you just have large numbers of desperate Palestinians swarming these trucks and taking whatever they can get their hands on.
Well, you mentioned Hamas a moment ago. Has Hamas collapsed? Has Hamas just virtually invisible to the average Gazan? What is Yeah, what in your assessment, what is happening with Hamas right now on the ground in Gaza?
Well, I think in order to answer your question, we have to look at two aspects of the Hamas movement. One is the military, what are known as the Qassam
Right,
brigades. That's the armed force of the
right,
of the Hamas movement, and
yeah,
it's obviously been significantly, or even very significantly, weakened. But at the same time, is far from defeated and incapacitated. Thus, just this past week, in a series of ambushes, I think they killed something like 10 or 11 Israeli soldiers and wounded dozens of others. It's obviously a shadow of what it was in October 2023, but all indications are that to a greater or lesser extent, it remains a coherent fighting force with command and control, weaponry conduct its operations, and so on. The other element of Hamas is governance and administration. Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip
right,
in June of 2007 and has ruled that territory hegemonically since that time. And since October of 2023, Israel has identified the elimination of Hamas's capacity to govern the Gaza Strip as a war objective. And in so doing, it has targeted not only Hamas's military capacity and armed fighters, but also its governing structures, its civil servants, its civil agencies, and so
right,
on. And there have been multiple incidents where, for example, Hamas civilian police forces who were deployed by the movement to ensure the orderly distribution of aid and things of that sort have been deliberately targeted by the Israelis. Now, whether Hamas retains the power to govern the Gaza Strip or not is somewhat of a moot point, because while I believe that its capacity to govern the Gaza Strip has been very substantially weakened, it also remains the strongest power in the Gaza Strip. But more importantly, Hamas has already accepted that should this genocidal military campaign come to an end and a new administration be established in the Gaza Strip, that Hamas will not directly participate in it. It has agreed with its
right,
chief rival, the Fatah movement, that governance in the Gaza Strip will be in the hands of what's called a technocratic committee of specialists who will not that will not include known or active members of either Hamas or
or
Fatah.
yeah. Thank you. That's great. I so appreciate you were coming in and sharing such expert opinions with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rob, I know you have a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and bring Michael on the screen as well. So, Mouin, thank you so much for being with us. You know, one of the things that you're such an expert and such a gentleman as well. I appreciate so much what you're doing for us. One of the things that happens in these conversations, though, Mouin, is that I say one thing to somebody here in the United States or whatever, and they immediately respond with some other propaganda from the other side, and it's so unbelievably propagandized, and the information is so distorted. So, can you talk to us a little bit about the media and what's happening? Is Gaza, first off, and the story there being underreported and misrepresented in the mainstream media? And if so, can you speak to maybe why you think that's happening?
Well, it's I believe both underreported and misrepresented. The only thing I could really say in the media's defense is that we're dealing with a war, the genocide, I would argue, that's now gone on for almost 2 years. And it's perhaps natural that after a certain point in time, it no longer dominates the headlines on a daily basis. And it's only the particularly outrageous atrocities that will once again put the story at the top of the news agenda. But having said that, if we look at most mainstream media, you know, BBC, CNN, New York Times, and so on, there is a tendency to always give Israel the benefit of the doubt, to ensure that whatever the story is that's being covered, that Israel's point of view is brought across clearly, while downplaying and casting doubt on the Palestinian perspective. So I'll give an example. There's a Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip. Yes, I mean, I think in journalistic terms, it's not illegitimate to refer to it as the Hamas-run military Ministry of Health, because of course Hamas has controlled the government in the Gaza Strip. Hamas appoints the Minister of Health, and so on. But having said that, this is a Ministry of Health with a record that can be examined. And what we learned when we look at its record is that its data is considered reliable by both Israeli and US intelligence, and that the data it has produced during previous Israeli onslaughts on the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021 has consistently checked out. And additionally, the Gaza Ministry of Health takes a very conservative attitude to recording casualty statistics. Now, every time this issue comes up, for example, in the BBC, they systematically refer to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. They never say the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, whose data have proven to be reliable over many years. So it's kind of seeking to cast aspersions. While at the same time, it's always, whenever an incident is covered, then this next line is always Israel says. Well, I think for journalistic purposes, it's entirely legitimate that the reader is informed of Israel's perspective on a particular incident or event or development. But when you say Israel says, and you quote their army spokesman, an effort should also be made to demonstrate that, this is an institution, and I'll put it very bluntly because it's true, that has systematically distorted the truth, that has systematically claimed that things that happened didn't happen, or that there's someone else's fault. You had, I believe it was a month or two ago, if I'm not mistaken, this massacre of 15 Palestinian medical workers, in which Israel first said it didn't happen, then gave all kinds of stories until a video emerged from one of those that got killed, showing that these medical workers had their ambulance lights on, contrary to what Israel claimed initially, that they were not armed, contrary to what Israel claimed. So in Israel's case, it's only when definitive documented proof is produced to demonstrate that they have been distorting the truth or lying, that their version of events is called into question. But so it's always the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, as if its information is by definition partisan, versus Israel says, which we basically have to accept on faith because we're never told about its record.
Right. Well, yeah, there's a wonderful TED Talk that I think goes into some of the exposing the propaganda that comes up here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and you've got a book coming out in January of 2026 called Gaza Apocalypse. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that book for just a few minutes?
Well, the background to this is that I've been posting a variety of threads about various historical issues and developments in Palestine since October of 2023. And I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book edited by Jamie Stern Weiner, who then also suggested that several of my Twitter threads be reproduced in that book as articles. And then later it emerged that there was insufficient space in the volume to include these. And we then came upon the idea of, compiling a number of these, along with some other stuff that I had written previously, with kind of a long introduction and a long conclusion, and that would be the book.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we want to remind everyone as well that if you want to stay tuned for more information and live streams of such as this, you can go ahead and make sure you subscribe to the Christian Forum in Israel-Palestine YouTube channel. Hit the alert button so that you can be alerted of other live streams coming up. We have another interview coming up maybe early in August. Or you can subscribe to the Determined Truth YouTube page as well. We've got a live stream actually this evening talking more things as well. So a couple of ways to stay informed there also. So Mouin, let me go a little bit further with the idea of the media with my question. That is, what are some of the most dangerous misconceptions that you see in the media regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you've been encountering? What are some of the most, especially the misinformation, the things that are just simply factually wrong?
Well, there are any number of such misconceptions, but just to look at the present case, I think one is the assumption that this all started on the 7th of October, 2023, that somehow everything we're talking about now emerged suddenly out of a vacuum with no context, no history, and so on. And I think it's very, when we're talking about newspapers, of course, one doesn't expect them to recount the entire history of the question of Palestine as a preamble to a news article. But it is, I think, vitally important to point out that yes, Hamas did attack southern Israel on the 7th of October, 2023. But the question of Palestine is over a century old. The other thing is this constant both sides, as if we're talking about the Iran-Iraq war or the conflict in Ukraine, where you have two states and one has invaded another. We're dealing here with a conflict, if I can use that word, between occupier and occupied. We're dealing with a colonial conflict that is essentially no different from that which we saw in South Africa in the previous century, or Angola, or Vietnam, or Algeria. And this kind of basic reference point of what this is about is typically missing from mainstream news coverage. Another is to present the Palestinians as somehow an indistinct part of a much larger agglomeration of Arabs, of Muslims, what have you. Well, first of all, of course, Palestine is not an exclusively Muslim society, far from it. And secondly, one has to yes, there may be 1 billion Muslims in the world, or however many there are, and there are also 1 billion Christians in the world, if that number is correct. But no one would claim, that somehow Peruvians and Germans and Armenians, are all kind of acting in concert with a common agenda to similar issues. So this kind of lack of attention to specificities, and the third, of course, is one doesn't necessarily have to accept every item of international law and so on, or every United Nations resolution, but at least don't distort what it actually says. So you often hear about Jewish settlement in the West Bank, which many countries consider to be in violation of international law, but Israel contests that. Well, these settlements are not illegal because many countries consider them illegal. They're illegal because they're a direct violation of international law, whatever any country may think about it. It's considered a war crime under the Rome Statute. So whether I think they're illegal or you think they're illegal is entirely irrelevant, because it's there, black on white, but it's this attempt to always kind of, how should I put it, soften the blow whenever Israeli conduct is at issue, and this constant default to the passive voice. 28 Palestinians die in the Gaza Strip.
Right.
Was it an earthquake? Was it flash floods like in Texas, or were these 2,000-pound U.S. supplied bombs that were dropped by the Israeli Air Force on tents outside Khan Yunis?
Right. Yeah, somebody killed them. They didn't just die.
Exactly.
So you have a a weekly podcast. It's live stream on YouTube as well. I guess it's called Palestine This Week. Are there other ways that we can follow your work in particular? And then second question is, do you have other media sources that you recommend if we want to stay informed on these issues that you would recommend that we follow?
Yes. Well, the weekly podcast, and thanks for mentioning it. It's not mine. It's actually a podcast produced by Middle East Monitor, and I think for about a year now, one of their journalists, Nassim Ahmed, he and I conduct a weekly conversation on latest developments, primarily on Palestine, but also more broadly about the region. Next to that, I have my own podcast. It's called Connections, which I started in 2021, in which also I look at a variety of issues, primarily relating to the Middle East, and not just Palestine, but also, Sudan, Syria, Iran, the Gulf, and other issues. And most of my material is published both on the website of Jadaliyya and also on my Substack under my own name.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. You want to go ahead and come and jump in?
I'd love to. Mouin, before I jump into the subject matter I've been asked to cover, I've got to say, as someone who works in publishing, that when you're given a chance to plug your book, you should be saying something like, maybe the most significant publication to come out on the war in Gaza.
But I did say that.
You said it almost like I'm a Canadian. I was going to say you said it almost like a Canadian would, so self-effacing. I look forward to seeing that book.
Thank you.
I really do. So I'm sorry, I couldn't help to throw in the publishing angle.
Thank you.
That's been my lifetime career. I want to ask you about the long game of what's happening in Gaza from Israel's point of view, and I've got a couple of background voices in my head when I ask the question.
Sorry, the what from Israel's point of view?
The long game. Where are they actually thinking this is going, and what? And is there strategy beyond the political survival of Netanyahu? And the voices in the background of my head are probably insufficient, but they include Ilan Pappé, who we interviewed some weeks ago here, who sees this conflict sort of as the last gasp of Zionism, that it's going to be forced to show itself, and eventually, even though it'd be very costly in lives, it's sort of it's on its way out to something different. In contrast, Peter Beinart, who we interviewed as well, a very, very interesting interview, was more sanguine and wondered if in some way this story of Palestine is one where the bad guys win, so to speak, where, like in history, we do have narratives that do not end well for a people. They wind up being more or less crushed under the wheels of history, and they may survive in remnants, but their story goes very badly. Peter updated that recently with a very good vlogcast, I guess you'd call it, where he was basically asking Jewish leaders, was this worth it? People said from the beginning, there's no winning this. This is going to be costly in lives and money and so on, and we're going to be back where we started. So I look at this and I see, and of course Trump comes in, and now there's a new, just wildly incoherent input, coming into the mix. Is there still at the beginning, the end game was destroy Hamas. That's it, full stop. Are they thinking long term? I mean, Peter's point in his broadcast was, you've created generations of probably even far more radicalizable Palestinian youth who are going to grow up and want revenge. What's the long game? That's a long worded question. Sorry.
Well, no, yeah, it's a very good question, and let me just preface my remarks by referring to something you said and point out that, as I think you would agree, the dustbin of history is littered with just causes. So the mere fact that Palestine is a just cause offers absolutely no guarantee of its success. And what we've seen in the past 2 years is really a sea change in public opinion, particularly in the West and even in North America, um, uh, in favor of Palestinian rights and increasingly opposed to Israeli apartheid, and particularly now genocide. But these changes in public opinion will take time to filter into the political arena and ultimately to result in changes in policy. And given the intensity of the Israeli assault on the Palestinians, one could argue that we're really in a race against time. Will these changes find a meaningful political expression before there is no more Palestine or Palestinians left to save? So that would be my general response. Now, regarding your specific question about whether Israel has a long-term strategy, yes and no. I mean, if you'll recall, in October 2023, Israel and its military and political leadership were thrown into total disarray. Chaos reigned. They were really knocked off balance. And their initial response to those attacks was really driven primarily, if not exclusively, by revenge and bloodlust. And that's kind of the genesis of the Gaza genocide. Then what we began to see in the summer of last year was that Israel appeared to have regained its footing, regained its confidence, and went on the offensive, certainly in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but also in Lebanon, bombings of Yemen. Then in December, these massive attacks on Syria, and most recently, the war on Iran. And I think that if you look at this from Israel's perspective, it views itself as currently engaged in a campaign to fundamentally transform the strategic reality of the Middle East for at least a generation. I call it a 1967 moment, where, of course, in June 1967, in the space of 6 short days, Israel dealt a crushing blow to its main Arab adversaries and completely transformed the strategic reality of the Middle East for a generation. And I think Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, sees itself as engaged in a similar initiative now. But I also think that part of this is its view that it can settle the Palestine question once and for all by essentially removing most Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, arguably from the West Bank as well, and even, if possible, from within Israel, and annex these territories. The question then becomes: has Israel bitten off more than it can chew? I mean, it's one thing to destroy the Egyptian and Syrian and Jordanian armies and occupy West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula, which is very underpopulated. It's quite another to be on a permanent war footing, because Israel, for all its power and for all its strength, primarily derived from the U.S., of course, Israel is not a very large country. It doesn't have the population of India. And whether it will be able to sustain this permanent war footing is very much an open question, because what we've also seen since October is that Israel's threat perception and strategic doctrine has changed. Prior to October 2023, Israel's military doctrine was that wars need to be short, decisive, and fought on enemy territory, and that it would deter real and emerging enemies through the possession of overwhelming military force. Its new doctrine is that possessing this overwhelming military force is insufficient, and it needs to actually deploy it wherever and whenever it thinks a threat may be emerging. So you're talking about a permanent campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, a regular campaign against Iran, making sure Syria doesn't rearm, bombing Yemen regularly, to say nothing of what's happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Personally, I don't believe that this is a campaign that Israel can indefinitely sustain. Maybe it can militarily, maybe it has enough pilots to do this. But can the economy sustain a permanent war footing? Will society tolerate a permanent war footing? So I fully understand what Ilan Pape said, and I'd like to agree with him, but at the same time, I would also caution that it's probably too early to make a definitive assessment of where things are heading.
Well, Ian, could you just comment for a moment on one thing that's on my mind? Benjamin Netanyahu just finished a meeting in Washington, I think his third, and it seems to me that there is a kind of Trump-Netanyahu idea that is a part of the long game, and that is relocating Gaza Palestinians into other countries. And of course, the key word that they've used is choice. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the West loves choice. Yeah. So Gazans are going to be able to choose if they're going to go to another country or if they are going to stay where they are. What do you see this now as something that is surfacing and it's an American-Israeli plan?
Well, if I can just back up for a moment to provide a bit of context. You may recall that in October 2023, a number of Israeli leaders immediately came out with this idea that, we have to expel all the Palestinians and they should all be moved to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. And in fact, relocating, I'll back up a bit, in 1948, the Gaza Strip didn't exist. The Gaza Strip came into existence as a result of the establishment of Israel and the mass dispossession of the Palestinians, and the Gaza Strip constitutes 1% of the territory of the British Mandate of Palestine, which in 1947 had a population of 80,000, and in 1949 had a population of approximately 250,000. And over the years, approximately 75% of the population of the Gaza Strip are 1948 refugees. Israel, from the outset, has been consistently uncomfortable with the idea of having so many refugees sitting on its border, essentially within spitting distance of their former homes. And it's perhaps also for this reason that the Gaza Strip played an absolutely central role in the emergence and development of the contemporary Palestinian national movement. And over the years, Israel has put forward a number of proposals to achieve what it calls the thinning out of the population of the Gaza Strip, basically seeking to remove a significant proportion of Palestinian refugees, particularly from the Gaza Strip, to elsewhere, to Libya, to Iraq, to other places. And in the 80s and 90s, this kind of ambition became pretty much the preserve of the Israeli extreme right, and you didn't hear it that much anymore in mainstream Israeli discourse. In October 2023, it almost immediately became government policy and popular consensus. And the former Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in his first visit to the region, actually tried to market this idea, but he was basically told it's a non-starter by the Arab governments that he met with. Then in February of this year, Trump came up with his Gaza Riviera proposal, if you'll recall, and it's basically you move out all the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, you rebuild it as a golf course or a casino or whatever it is, and then other people come to live there. And although it was a harebrained scheme that was never going to see the light of day, it did give Israel the pretext to make this official government policy and to say our policy is the implementation of what the U.S. president has proposed. Now, the key issue here is that Arab governments, which had been quite content to watch Israel slaughter Palestinians within their homeland for over a year, immediately, publicly, collectively, firmly rejected the Gaza Riviera proposal because they viewed the export of Palestinians to their territory as a direct threat to their national security, to their domestic stability, and to what remains of their legitimacy. They recall that in 1948, when Israel expelled large numbers of Palestinians, ultimately that resulted in direct conflicts between these states and Israel, or conflicts between these states and the Palestinians, or both. And this is something they are determined to avoid. So that's a long way of getting to the response to your question, which is to say that given what appears to be a continued collective Arab refusal to play along with the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, I think Israel's ambition is to create a situation similar to that which you had in Syria during its civil war. You know, there was never a policy of forcibly expelling Syrians from Syria by the government or anyone else. What you had is a situation that became so untenable for so many Syrians, either because of the violence or because of the economic crisis and so on, that a growing number of Syrians simply upped sticks and left because they felt it was no longer tenable to remain there. And I think this is what Israel is aiming at in the Gaza Strip, to create a situation of chaos and anarchy that a growing number of Palestinians find so untenable that they'll get into a raft to try to make it to Cyprus or try to sneak across a border to Egypt or whatever. That, I think, is where we're heading.
Thanks.
Wow.
It's great.
Mouin, this has been so great. Thank you so much. I think we're going to go ahead and go to David. And David, you want to bring us to a close? We want to respect your time, Mouin. Thank you so much.
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just change the focus for a little bit with the few minutes we have left here. I've got two questions for you, Mouin. One, it appears that Israel is now performing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And I'm wondering if you could catch our readers up with the conditions there today, and what do you think Israel's goals are for what it's doing there?
Well, in some respects, you can compare it to what's happening in the Gaza Strip. So, particularly during the past 6 to 8 months, Israel's launched a very large-scale offensive in the northern West Bank, in the areas of Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas, now moving increasingly to Nablus. It has destroyed vast portions of the refugee camps in Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas. It has displaced 40 to 50,000 Palestinians from those areas, which are the largest displacements in the West Bank since 1967. And it is now gradually moving increasingly south. I think Israel's objectives are twofold. First of all, again, to create conditions where Palestinians who are able to relocate to Jordan or anywhere else feel that that is a preferable thing to do. But it may also be in preparation for an agreement, an expectation perhaps, that the Trump administration will recognize Israel's claims of sovereignty over all or parts of the West Bank. In other words, Israeli annexation.
Wow.
And Mouin, finally, I'm wondering, do you see any signs of hope for the future, or does it all just look bleak and despairing?
Well, it certainly looks extraordinarily bleak, extraordinarily bloody, and extraordinarily despairing, and seems to go from bad to worse with every passing day. Having said that, as I mentioned earlier, there's been an extraordinary wave of recognition of what's happening in Palestine, that it is morally wrong, that it needs to stop, and that Palestinians have rights too. That has been an extremely hopeful sign, particularly in the West, because Israel is absolutely reliant on, first and foremost, the United States, but also the European Union, which is its largest trading partner. I do believe change is coming. Israel has clearly violated every conceivable red line. Of course, its impunity derives from the unconditional support it has received from its US and European partners. But I do think this ultimately does represent a turning point. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the question is, once that corner has been turned, what will there be left to save?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Can I add just
Yeah.
one mini question at the very end
Of
here?
course.
As you speak of this hope, it gives me a tiny bit of hope. When I see the criminalization of protests in the West, and even the UK. I mean, there's been crackdown on protests in the UK that has been bringing attention to the Palestinian cause. I know other parts of Europe, there's been more gains in this way, recognition of Palestine as a state and so on. Is there any hope more for us in our backyard? What are there signs in the US that give you hope? And it can just be brief. But
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent poll on that was shown on CNN. I don't think it was a CNN poll. And if you look at Democrats who now have shifted from primarily supporting Israel to the Palestinians, even among older Democrats, it's an absolute sea change. And there's also been a significant, though much smaller, shift among Republicans. And of course, these changes are most pronounced among younger than older generations. But what's interesting is if you look, for example, at the recent Democratic primary in New York City, for the first time, it was the younger generations that voted in far larger numbers than the older generations. This directly contradicts kind of an established pattern over many decades. I think what's important to recognize is that politicians, like the Trump administration, like Starmer and Keir Starmer in Great Britain, they view Palestine as the weak link, and therefore they're constantly using opposition to Palestinian rights, opposition to protests in support of Palestinian rights, as kind of the battering ram to crack open established rights that they then will use to prosecute and persecute any range of others. And my sense is that people are gradually catching on to this, that if you're fine with the government doing this against activists for Palestine, you may very well be next.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Mouin. As we close, maybe I want to give you an opportunity, if you don't mind, to
Please.
speak to us. Here we are asking you questions. Here we are, Christian leaders, theologians. We have a pretty conservative Christian audience that are watching us as well. What's the message you have for us, whether it's us as leaders or whether our audience is watching? What kind of things you want to say to us?
Yes, thank you for that opportunity. I don't like to speak in sectarian terms, if that's the right way to put it, because Palestinians, of course, are a people, irrespective of their faith or background or anything else. But Palestine is where Christianity emerged. The first Christians were in Palestine. The oldest Christian community in the world exists in Palestine, and it has suffered enormously as a result of the emergence of Zionism and the establishment of Israel, and now the Israeli occupation and apartheid and genocide and so on. And so, I would hope that those Christians who believe that Zionism is somehow a required element of their faith would also take a moment to look at the experience of Palestinian Christians and see how what they believe, what Christian Zionists believe, is a proper application of their faith, how that is leading to the destruction and elimination of Christianity in the land where it first emerged. And again, don't take my word for it.
Yeah.
Ask Palestinian Christians,
Right.
and they will be more than happy to tell you.
Right. Again, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate everything that you've given to us. And again, if you want to follow us and subscribe on our YouTube channel to get more interviews like this, we would appreciate it. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah.